You are listening to Rootbound, a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside.
This episode of Rootbound is supported by Root Nodules. Do you need a home for your nitrogen-fixing bacteria? Try Root Nodules. Your bacteria will love it.
Hello everybody, thank you for listening to this episode of Rootbound. I'm the host of the show, and my name is Steve. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, and each week I invite a guest who joins me on the program to share with us all about a plant that means something to them, and then I share with a guest about a plant that means something to me, and through this process we can all learn more about plants and learn more about each other. It is the philosophy of this show that everybody has at least one plant that is meaningful to them because plants are so integral to our lives as humans on this planet. Now, I would like to share with you a concept that I just learned after I was doing some research following the conversation I had with our guest today. Did you know that apple blossoms are perfect flowers? And sunflowers, those are also just perfect flowers. On the other hand, squash blossoms, those are imperfect. And what about the flower on corn? That's also imperfect. Now, that's not a judgment call. I actually think all those flowers are really awesome, and they're perfect in my eyes. But there is actually a botanical definition of perfect and imperfect flowers. And so the definition of a perfect flower is a flower that has both stamens and pistil on the same flower. So if you think of something like a tulip, and you look at those like parts of the flower in the middle, some of those are the stamens and some of those are the pistils, and so that makes it a perfect flower. Whereas imperfect flowers only have either stamens on one flower and pistils on another flower, but they don't have them both on the same flower. So if you think about a squash blossom that I was talking about, you'll know that there's male and female squash flowers, and that makes them, by botanical definition, imperfect flowers. So I thought that was an interesting fact that I learned after I was doing a little bit of research today. And with that, let's meet our guest.
You're perfect, your manner is so inviting. You're perfect, and do what you may. You're more than okay. You're perfect, I'd even put that in writing. You're perfect, I mean it in a great big way.
Hi, Pam. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Rootbound.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, yeah, we are excited to have you here. Do you have any plants to share with us today? Or a plant to share with us today?
I have lots of plants, but I'll share today the Monstera Adansonii, or also known as Swiss cheese plant.
Very cool. Okay, when you sent this to me, I guess I knew in the back of my mind that there was more than one kind of Monstera, but I never really. I'm not a houseplant guy, actually, as a plant podcast, but I like gardening. I like
outside,
wild plants. So
that's what I realized.
So anyway, I'm very excited to hear about this because I saw, Monstera Adansonii, but it's not Monstera deliciosa, which is the one everybody knows, I guess.
Right.
And sometimes that one's called Swiss cheese plant too, I guess, the other Monstera, but this one looks more Swiss cheesy. I Googled it quickly. Anyway, I'm talking too much. Tell me about this plant. Why is it meaningful to you, the Monstera Adansonii?
So it was really hard for me to pick a plant, to be honest. But I ended up with that one because it's a warrior. I've always been attracted to plants with fenestrations. So the regular or the most popular Monstera, they do have the fenestrations, but they're so big. And if you take care of them, they just grow so much. And this one is smaller. However, it could get also big. Like there's been plants like that can get up to 3 feet at one leaf.
Oh, wow. So for the audience, really quickly, could you describe what fenestration means? Because it's kind of a fancy word, but
Yes.
I'll let you describe that.
So the fenestrations are the holes basically that the plants create. And with the Swiss cheese or the Adansonii plant, basically they grow in really tropical areas where it rains, where there's a lot of air, and they're typically you can find them in South America. And they climb, so they're climbers. Now that they've been domesticated, I guess, you can hang them and they look really pretty like hanging. And so the fenestrations for the Adansonii are really cool because it's kind of like a survival mechanism that they created. So they create these big holes in the leaves because there's so much air and wind and water that it just has to get through as they're climbing trees, that it's the way for them to survive.
Wow.
It's cool, huh?
I can't believe I've never thought of the reason why they do that before. Like, I even had an episode earlier with someone about Monstera Adansonii, and we talked about it, but I never thought about it. But it's very logical now, thinking about their habit, that, you get like a Amazonian downpour coming on you, and
right.
you don't want all the water to just stay on you, right? You, like, knock you off the tree. Very clever.
Yeah, right? So that's one of the reasons why I love them, because they're warriors. The other one is because they're queer. They're queer plants, so they're bisexual.
Oh.
They're in the Monstera family, and they do both. So they have a female and male in the same. I'm not I don't have I learned it and I was like, oh, this is really cool. So I don't have the scientific language for it, but basically
Sure.
they have both genders. So they
Male
can
and
create.
female on the same plant. Yeah, interesting. And now that's something I don't know a ton about as well, so audience can Google it. But I know that appears in a few different ways in plants, and sometimes it's on the same flower, sometimes it's separate flowers. But I'm not sure if you know specifically of this one, how it happens.
I believe it's in the same flower, and it's called inflorescence. But that's the other thing that I'm like, oh, this plant is so cool because it's a queer plant. And then when I finally got one, she's a super warrior because I can tell you the story if you want, but
Yeah, please. Yeah, let's talk about it. So I was
dive
about to
into
ask,
it.
you have one of these.
I have one.
Plants.
So I'm weird with my plants because I do want the plants to call me in, and so I don't just get any plant. And I had been looking for a Swiss plant for a long time, but it wasn't like the right one. And so my mom knows I like plants. There was a point in my life I had to close my office, and so I had plants in my office, I had plants at home, and so when I closed my office I had to bring all my plants to my house. And so it went from I have some plants here and there to I have to make room for all the other plants that came from the office. And my mom was like, well, let me bring you another plant. So we went to the farmer's market, and there was this guy who, at the end of the farmer's market, when they're about to close, they're give you everything cheap. And he had one, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is my chance, because this is the one. She's the one that nobody wanted. The runt. I'll take her. And she came home with me. She was super, it wasn't super big, but she had, a couple of leaves. And she didn't like my house. And so everything died. And I'm like, this is one of the easiest plants in the world. Really? How? And so I was like, all right. I was really sad. And there was one stem left. So after a minute. And so I repotted it, put it in a different pot, and I put it at the bottom of my plant shelf. Because I was like, if she wants to grow, she will grow. And then I kind of neglected her for a minute. But I think from the top plants, she was receiving all the drips of the water.
Ah.
And so after maybe a month or so, I realized that she started climbing in the shelf, in the plant shelf. And she just kind of came back to life. So this is why she's one of my favorites.
That's so cool. I think it's pretty cool with the Monsteras, at least from the Deliciosas I've seen. A lot of them keep them in this way that is not climbing, but it is really cool to see them climb, because that is what they
want to do.
Want to do, which is very cool.
Yeah.
That's super cool. How long have you had your Monstera Adansonii?
I would say a few years. Probably maybe a year and a half, maybe 2. So not that long.
Do you name your plants?
Yes, 100%.
Okay. What is this Swiss cheese plant's name, if you don't mind sharing?
I don't mind sharing. She's Lisa.
Lisa, that's a good. I have 2 succulents. Sometimes I don't count them as houseplants because they're a little bit a different thing. But I have one legit houseplant, which is it's a Calathea. Technically, it's a Guppertia because they split those into 2 different genuses. But also known as a rattlesnake plant, and her name is Tabitha. Yeah.
Ooh.
So, yeah.
I love that. So I name my plants first my family members. And then once I run out of family members, then I just start finding names of people that I like or names that just come up. And so she just became Lisa.
Do you want to share who Lisa is, or is that too personal?
So Lisa is, I have a couple of Lisas in my life. I have I don't know. So I guess I'll share a little bit. So one of my clients, she's Lisa, and she's a warrior. And so because she's overcome so many things. And so when this one, she actually didn't have a name for a minute because, you know, she didn't want to survive because I was like, you gave up on me.
And you got to wait to learn the personality a little bit, right? Yeah.
Totally. And so because so to backtrack a little, this client of mine, which I guess I've revealed the name, she has taught me a lot about taking space because I'm trying to think, how do I reveal without revealing? So she's one of those women, she's like 20 years older than me. And she, when things haven't gone her way, she takes literally 5 minutes to like have a pity party, and then she's like, all right, let's take action. What are we going to do? And so she's done so many things with the government. She's changed like laws and things like that. Again, I'm being cryptic because
Sure, that's fine. Yeah, that's fair. I understand. Yeah.
but she's really cool. And so when this one started climbing, when the plants started climbing, I was like, oh, you don't give up. You know, you give yourself the time to kind of like chill for a second, but then you just keep going. So that's where she
Okay,
got her name.
the last personal question is, does the Lisa know about the plant Lisa?
She doesn't know.
Okay. Well, maybe she'll find out. That's an honor. Yeah. So we'll see. Well, that's really nice. That's a really nice story. Okay. What else about this plant? Do you have any other fun facts and dazzling details about the Monstera Adansonii?
I think she's very social because what I realized is that when she had just arrived to the house, I kind of like, you know, put her aside without meeting all the other plants. And then when I was like, whatever, you want to die, I'll put you at the bottom of the plant. She was like, oh, this is a place where I can talk to the other plants. So that's why I think she started like climbing up so she can, and then right above her, I have a really weird, I don't know what it is, to be honest. It was a gift. But that one grows like 2 stems, and then one dies, and then another one grows. So it's always like 2 all the time. It's really interesting. And so she's been climbing around her, and then above that one, I have a pothos. I don't know which kind. There's so many of them.
Yeah.
And she's also climbing around her. And so
cool.
She's like a grandmother.
Yeah. And it's really interesting too to reminds of like the habit in the jungle, because there's like so many other plants, right? You don't have a solo plant in the jungle, right? You have lots of plants in the jungles, and they have that really, really interesting to see that kind of attitude in a way to like go up, right? And you know, yeah, that's really fascinating. I've been to the jungle in South America a few times, but it was like kind of before I had a lot of plant knowledge. I've been doing this podcast for like over 2 years now, and I feel like the most of the stuff I learned about plants has been doing this podcast.
Makes sense.
But I wish that I had. I'm sure I have actually seen a Monstera, or I've been around one in the wild, because I think they're relatively common, and I've been in a lot of different places. But I'm bummed that I'd never like recognized it.
No,
because like, you know, like I never like took my mind out to say, oh yes, that's Monstera in its native place. So next time, I don't know when the next time I will be in the jungle actually, but if I do, I have so many more plants I want to look out for, and a lot of them are these house plants, because a lot of house plants are from the jungle, and we've talked about this on the show before, because they don't mind the low light, because they're like covered in the jungle.
In the trees. I saw Monsteras in Puerto Rico and in Mexico.
Oh, cool. So what did they look like in the wild like that?
Wild. So I don't know if you've seen the Monsteras that like grow into like as tall as a broom. Well, that's them in the wild. And I remember when I was in Puerto Rico, we were driving, and literally it was like a whole, on the side of the road, instead of seeing like bushes that we normally see in the US, it was like monsteras, like deliciosas, the whole, and probably some of the Adansonis too. But it was like just like intertwined with each other and like just there existing. And I was like, oh, they're so cool.
That is really cool. It makes you, I think you can imagine seeing in the wild why they got that monstrous name,
Right.
because they're going to be so big.
Yes.
Very interesting. What about, where did you see them in Mexico?
In Cancun.
Ah, cool. And
Yeah.
was it similar or?
It was similar. We were, this time, I think this is where we went to, we did a tour. I went with my family, and it's kind of funny because I went as a Mexican tourist, my own country, which we can.
That's fine. Yeah, that's okay.
yeah,
I live in Washington, D.C. I go to the museum.
You go tours all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we went to do like a zip line tour. And so it was super fun. So each one of the zip lines had, like, basically you would go up the first one, and then the next one you would go up, it was higher and higher and higher. And so eventually we could see all the trees, but when we started, we could see all of the plants climbing on the trees. It was really cool.
Ah, that is cool. Yeah, I definitely got to pay more attention to that the next time in a place like that, because I want to spot all these plants that I've heard about and that we lose their context in houseplants. And it's actually pretty hard to like. Monstera is a little bit of exception because I think it's so famous, but a lot of houseplants, it's really kind of hard to find information of what they're like in the wild. Like my calathea, I know it's from Brazil, but I wanted to find like pictures of it growing in the wild, and it's I probably, if I knew how to Google in Portuguese or something like that better, I could do a better job of it. But it's hard to like track down because when you Google it, you just get all like the houseplant care stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
I know. When I was looking at like random things for the Adansonii, everything was like, how to care for your Adansonii. And I'm like, I know she likes to be neglected. That's what I know.
That's very, very interesting. Cool. Did we miss anything else about your Monstera or about the plant in general?
One thing that's really interesting is that they are prone to get a fungus that makes the leaf look really pretty. And so people don't realize that this is happening because they get discolored, but it's like, so the actual leaf is supposed to be this kind of like rich green. And sometimes when the plant has the fungus, it gets kind of like marble, like light greens, and it's really interesting. And the leaves get raised a little bit. And so a lot of people don't notice because they're like, oh, my plant is just so pretty. And it has whatever it's called when they get like the like the
variegations.
The variegation, thank you.
Yeah.
And so sometimes people could confuse that. So that's something interesting to look out for.
So you're saying that this thing that looks like a variegation is actually a fungal thing?
In the Adansonii,
in Monstera, because like some variegations are caused by viruses, but non-damaging viruses. But this is different. This is something that could actually cause problems for your plant.
It could, and according to what I read, there was a big kind of like a batch of Adansonis that went out into the world, and they were all infected. And so many people were reporting like this thing, and so you had to like clip the plants that were infected. Yeah, it's a whole thing.
Interesting. Yeah, that wow. Like, I'm sure that the people who are in charge of like plant disease were like, oh no,
right?
How do we get track this down?
And the challenge is that the majority of these plants came out of like big box stores, and so like it's not like nurseries were selling because probably they would know, but it was like the stores that you go get your milk from. They have random plants.
Yeah, I wonder what the like large scale commercial growing of some of these houseplants looks like. Like I think a lot of it happens in Florida, but it'd be interesting to see how that whole market works because it must be fascinating and how it all like filters into different places and especially because I think they can. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah. Anyway, I could wonder about that for a while. One last question. Do you know? I know that Monstera deliciosa. I learned this in the episode. It's called Monstera deliciosa because it can fruit, and the fruit is apparently delicious.
Oh.
It is apparently. It looks like kind of looks like a corn cob. if you look it up, the Monstera Deliciosa. But apparently it's super sweet and like tastes like Fruity Pebbles, I guess. But do you know anything about the flower or the fruit of the Adansonii?
I don't think it's edible. What I know is that it's both genders, so male, female. And another thing is that it was confused for like the Adansonii has had, and maybe that's why it's not as popular as the Deliciosa, because it has so many different names. People confuse it all the time. So they call it Swiss cheese when there's like other, like Swiss cheese plant could be like so many plants with holes. And people just kind of like call it a Swiss cheese plant. And so that's one funky thing that also has happened is that I think at some point it had two different scientific names, and then finally they settled into the Adansonii, and they were like, all right, let's go with it because it's the same plant. Because there's variations. So it's not like this type of monster is not like the Deliciosa that's very particular. Like the leaves are pretty, identifiable. This one, sometimes they're long, sometimes they look like a heart, sometimes they're pointy. And so because, they're their own, they have their own mind.
It's trickier. So how many, last question, I'm asking too many questions about your plant. How many leaves does your plant have now?
Now, and it's just one string, because it's just the one that survived. So probably has, the thing is that she's wrapped up everywhere. Because I have one of those like shelf things. And so probably like 20, 30, maybe 40 leaves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And are they big leaves or are they like smaller?
No, they're probably like 3 to 5 inches.
Interesting. And they all have holes in them.
Yeah.
That's so cute.
I know. And so I've been debating, I don't know if I want to clip it, and like start rooting to make it shorter. But I kind of like that she's like wilding out, and like wrapping herself around all the other plants. I don't know.
Oh, very good. Thank you for sharing about thank you for sharing about Lisa with me. Do you mind if I share a plant with you?
Please.
Okay, so this one, you probably, I'm going to guess you know some stuff about this plant. It's kind of a new plant to me. It's a plant that I encountered recently, and I didn't know anything about it. And there's kind of a funny story of how I encountered it. So my wife is Mexican. She was born and raised in Mexico City. That's where you're from too, right?
Oh, I'm from Mexico City, yeah.
Yeah. So so every time I go to Mexico City with her, I end up learning about new plants and yeah.
I saw some things and I'm like, why are you there, Mexico City, so much? I understand now. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. So I married into it, and we were just there over the holidays, and we were at her grandma's house for her birthday party, her grandma's birthday party, and I love food. I love experiencing food in like a cultural context that is like kind of it's a privilege to be part of that, right? As not in that culture, to be in there and like, people are passing me food and stuff. And at one point someone passed me this plate and you're like, do you want to try some of this? And I thought at first that it was refried beans. It was like very dark. But then they're like, no, that's Romeritos.
Yes.
You know Romeritos?
Yes, of course. And you had them and you liked them?
I did.
I want to know all the things.
I did. So the funny story with it is I like that. I was like, oh, this is cool. For the audience, let me explain a little bit first. The Romeritos, which I'll get more to exactly what they are in a minute, but it's essentially a kind of green, like vegetable, leafy green, but it's traditionally cooked in mole, which if audience doesn't know, mole is that really awesome Mexican sauce that has some chocolate in it, but tons of other stuff. It's an amazing sauce. I mean, there's a lot of moles.
Right. I'm
sure there's somebody, you could do like a podcast about every kind of mole and probably go on forever.
Yeah.
So I tried some, and then my wife tried some, and then she goes, "Is there shrimp in this?" And I was like, "What? No." And then I Googled, and it was like, actually, yes, there is.
Yes.
There's dried shrimp in it, which I didn't know. My wife is allergic to shrimp. So luckily, she only had a little bit, and she just had a little scratchy throat or whatever. So we're safe there.
That's good.
But it was a little bit of a dramatic moment when we realized, because like nobody knew, and I think sometimes it's served with like, you can see little dried shrimps in it, but sometimes it just has like dried shrimp flakes in it, and it's harder to see, and that's how it was. So we couldn't really tell. So yeah, the traditional recipe is boiled and served with mole and dried shrimp, and then sometimes with nopales and potatoes as well, is my understanding. But I've only had it the once. I liked it. I really did like it. It was really. I'm gonna keep my eye out for it in some other places. Which that gets into. Let's talk about. That's why it's meaningful to me. I had this experience with it. A little bit of a drama, but also I got interested in the plant.
Good for her to identifying it ahead of time. Like,
she's really good at that stuff. It tastes. First, she's like, "Is this shrimp?" And I was like, "No, no." And then I first Googled it. It actually, one thing about the plant is that it grows in areas with salty soil, and so it actually has a salty taste on its own. When even if I only had it with the mole, so it's harder to tell. But I guess it can taste a little like the ocean. Even without the shrimp. So that's what I thought at first it was, but then I read a little bit more down the Wikipedia. It's like, oh, actually it does. So yeah, but I'm glad that she was able to identify it, because I didn't clock it at all, but I'm kind of don't have as a refined palate as she does. But yeah, let's actually talk about what the plant is.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of times we talk about foods, and we sometimes like treat the food different from the plant. So Romeritos is the name in Spanish, and you probably know this. So it's called Romeritos because Romero is rosemary. And Romeritos, when you look at the plant, it looks like rosemary.
like baby rosemary.
Like baby rosemary. Now, when you touch it, from what I understand, it's not like as hardy as rosemary. It's like very soft and kind of squishy, but from a distance. And so, yeah, so when Spanish speakers, first saw it when they showed up in Mexico, they're like, "Oh, little rosemary."
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a scientific name. It's actually there's actually a lot of this plant, and they're actually all over the world. And the genus is Suaeda, which I think comes from. I think I remember reading it comes from a reference to the name of the plant. I think in South Africa or something. But the version that is in Mexico, I think there's a couple. I couldn't track down exactly what the most common one used for the dish Romeritos is. It could be Suaeda pulvinata, it could be Suaeda nigra, it could be Suaeda mexicana, which makes sense. But then it's one of those things too. I try to start searching in Spanish. I'm not really great with Spanish, so that's where I probably need to go down the rabbit hole a little bit more to find out more about it. I did a little bit, and I did find some cool facts from there. But it is, the genus is Suaeda. In English, it is the plant, which there is Suaeda in Europe, in North America, all over the world, different ones. It is either called seepweed or sea blight, which both don't sound as appetizing as Romeritos.
Yeah. Can you find them in the U.S.?
Yeah, totally. You can. I mean, they're going to be a slightly different species, but apparently, from what I read, they're all edible in the same way. And there are some traditions of eating them, I think, in parts of Europe. I didn't read about anybody eating them, besides just forager folks in the U.S., like people who like to eat weird plants, which I'm going to keep my eye out for them and see if I can find some, because I would like to try it myself. And it's not something you can get imported from Mexico.
Right.
So. Yeah, so I'm gonna, or I don't want to wait till the next time I go to Mexico. So I'm going to see if I can track some down. Apparently they grow often in coastal areas, even though it's a little bit of the exception, because apparently one of the biggest places they grow in Mexico is in Mexico City. Actually, in Xochimilco is one of the largest regions for production, which is, I talked about it in an episode. We went to Xochimilco on that same trip, and I've been there a few times. I love that place. But in the actual, not the tourist part, but the actual farm part, they produce a lot. And I have a statistic that in 2022, the state of Mexico produced 2,042 tons of Romeritos, and Mexico City itself produced 1,524 tons of Romeritos.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's intense. It's a lot of Romeritos.
Yeah, totally. And my understanding is that that's the main commercial production, and the rest of Mexico, it's a little bit more like you have it in your garden, or there's some smaller stuff around, or you're even collecting it from the wild. But the commercial production, particularly, which I ate it around the holidays, but I think it's particularly eaten during the Easter season, I guess, is what I understand. That's in Mexico City, it's produced like that.
Huh. Yeah, I remember eating Romeritos always during the holidays. And it does, that's interesting that, I mean, I never kind of associated oh, it's weird that you put shrimp in this. But it's the dried shrimp that is like, now thinking about it, I'm like, that's strange. Like, why is it dried shrimp? It's like, like it is like, who came up with that? But it's really fascinating.
I think it is connected to, and is one thing that's super cool about it is it is connected to like pre-Columbian dish, and so I think that the dried shrimp and all that stuff comes from like pre-colonial Mexico City, and it's one of those dishes that's is pretty similar as far as we can tell to what was eaten like that. So I think that's where the shrimp still comes in, because if you think about like, it's the kind of food you're eating in winter. There's not a lot of stuff available. This thing though, you could probably still find green in winter, and if you dry your shrimp and other times, it's one of those foods that it like probably started as a survival food. It's like, well, I don't have chicken right now, or I don't have whatever meat I have right now, so I can't put my mole on that. I'll put my mole on the greens. So that's I think where the shrimp comes from. It's also, and I think one of the things that's now eaten around during Lent, because it falls within the Lent rules of not eating meat.
Totally.
Yeah. But it still has that nice meaty flavor, yeah.
And I mean, if my mom used to tell us all the time that it was like full of protein and full of like whatever. I don't know if there's facts, but I think
I have vitamin A, vitamin C, iron, potassium, calcium, fiber, and folates. It's apparently very healthy.
Yeah. So it's like, my mom would be like, you're gonna get full. It's really good for you. And so we would just be like disgusted eating like plants. But Mesoamerican culture, Mesoamerican indigenous traditional foods are pretty like vegetarian and vegan. Like pre-colonial foods are pretty meatless, because if we think about it, we didn't have, or indigenous people down in Mexico didn't have like pork, or all of that came after the colonization, and so they were eating armadillos and crickets and plants, and so it makes sense.
Yeah, there's it's like either you're hunting or you're like raising plants. But yeah, and I think in general a lot of diets are like that are not based off of like commercial agriculture, right? Because like meat's good for you, but it's hard to get it, and if it like ends up not being the dominant part of a lot of traditional diets. So there's exceptions to that, but
for sure.
But yeah, so it's really fascinating with that part. So then that comes to this awesome word which I've talked about when I forget the actual Spanish word for the specific plant that we call lamb's quarters in English, but that's the most common quelite. That's the word I want to bring up, is quelite, which Romeritos is a quelite.
Okay.
And there's another quelite, what's the most common quelite? If you were to say like quelites, what would you call that? I have to look that up. What is this? Lamb's quarters.
I don't
I'm Googling, audience, and I'm sorry.
Let me Google it too.
Quelites.
QUE?
Quelite is this word, QUELITES. So huazontles is I think the most common thing called quelites. Quelites is just a word that means edible greens. And it comes from a Nahuatl word, from what I understand.
Yep.
And so
radishes is another one.
So you can call. Oh yeah. So I think any green that is cooked or even eaten fresh. But yeah, huazontle is one that is in English called lamb's quarters, and that's another one. Also,
I would have picked one of those.
We were, yeah. We were calling we were growing papalo, which is sometimes called papalo quelite as well. So I just like the word quelite because it's like it's different from it's basically what we would call like greens, but it's a little bit more specific than that. It actually just means so edible herbs, yeah. And I always like a word that is from the native language too, which is cool when it comes into the other languages.
Totally. When you mentioned romeritos, I was thinking about verdolagas. I don't know if you've had verdolagas.
Oh, I don't know that one. How do you spell that one?
It's VER D as in David OLAGA.
Oh yeah, verdolagas. Oh, interesting. Mexican parsley is what it's being translated to. It does not look like parsley though.
No,
but that looks cool. I'm gonna another rabbit hole. But yeah, tell me about that one. Do you eat it similarly cooked, or is it more of a herb, or how would you?
No, you eat it like protein. So the way that I've eaten verdolagas, because quelites, so I think quelites are typically used as the main dish. So verdolagas also come sometimes within a sauce. So it could be with mole, it could be with red sauce, it could be, and then it's this like, you're just eating verdolagas.
It's purslane. It's purslane is the name in English. It's the leaves are a little bit like chunky, kind of almost succulent.
Yes,
like, right?
Very.
Yeah. I want to try. This is like one of the. I had an episode about this too. This is one of the most common, like, it's one of the most common weeds in the world, actually.
Verdolagas.
And, it's a really, really amazing plant. Yeah. It grows. Once you see it everywhere.
Oh, I see it.
I want to try eating some, but the problem is you can't. The places where you find it growing around, you don't want to eat that. So I've been meaning to find some, bring it back to my garden, let it grow a season, and then try eating it myself. But it's apparently really tasty, and that's How is it prepared in Mexico?
I've had it. I think you can make it in like different things. So sauce, and like people have added, I think, chicken to like shredded, and so it adds, the verdolaga adds to the texture. And because they're like you shared, the leaves are like meaty and like a little thick. It's, I don't know. It gives like, Mexican food is very much about texture, and so I don't know if you've noticed that when I came to the U.S. and people started talking about texture, and like one of my friends, for example, she was like, I don't like strawberries because of texture. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Everything is texture. And so I didn't understand texture until I came to the U.S. But verdolagas add a lot of texture to the plate, because it depends on also how they cook them, because sometimes, they're still a little bit, they need to be fully cooked, but they have this like crunch. They're just great. I like verdolagas more than romeritos.
Okay. I'm going to keep my eye out for that. And that's one that maybe would pop up on like a fancy Mexican restaurant menu here, because it is grown in a small amount of commercial in the United States. So I'm gonna keep my eye out for that one and definitely order it if I see it.
And it's prettier.
It is, and that plant. If you want to talk about the science stuff, I talked about this in the episode. I'm not going to go into too many details, but there's 3 different kinds of photosynthesis, and it can switch between 2 of them whenever it wants. Which is pretty, like, it uses whichever version is like the most valuable at the time, depending on it. So that's why it can be like a desert plant, but it can also grow in wet areas, and part of that has to do with that, which is pretty cool.
Cool.
When you like read about the science part, it's like pretty mind blowing. And I don't think there's many other plants that can do that, switching between the 2 different kinds, or the two of the 3. I have one last dazzling detail about Romeritos, but this goes to its European use. It's like old school, I think Renaissance, maybe medieval era European use, and that's it is one of many plants that in Europe was referred to as glasswort. And wort, I think, just means plant, or plant that's used for something. Audience can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But the other word is glass, and that's because this plant. And there's a few other plants that could be used like this, but this plant was used in glass making.
What?
Yeah, and so the process is pretty interesting. So I don't know that much about glass making, but I kind of gloss over it here. So when you're making glass, one thing that you need to do to make the glass easier to work, there's a thing that you add to the glass called flux. From my understanding, flux is some kind of product that you add that will lower the melting point. And so basically you like heat the glass up, you get it to melt, you add the flux, and then it stays meltier longer and you can work it easier, right? Is what a flux is for. And the first flux was potash, which is potassium carbonate, and you get that from just burning wood. And you could use the ash, and you turn that ash into a powder. There's ways that you could prepare it, and you add that. But that didn't make the glass wasn't as clear. And so somebody discovered that if you use what is called soda ash, which is sodium carbonate, you can make a much clearer glass. And the way they got the soda ash is by burning a plant like Romeritos or some other plants that they grow on the coast. They're salty by nature, and they sequester the sodium in their tissue. And so when you burn them, they end up making the sodium carbonate They make
Makes
some
sense.
potassium carbonate too, but they have a high enough concentration of salt in them that they make sodium carbonate, and then so when you turn that into the flux for glass making, you get a much clearer glass apparently.
Whoa, that's cool.
Yeah. So
That's
anyway,
awesome.
that was like one little rabbit hole. I was like, wow, I did not know. I didn't ever think about using a plant in glass making, but yeah,
Totally. But it's so interesting how like humans thought about that. Like how did they come up with it? It's like the edible plants, like
yeah, I was totally. I was reading about that too with yeah, I mean the use of ash is really interesting. There's lots of interesting uses of ash, and people have realized that. And some of the first chemistry, right? Because so my wife is a chemist, so I go down a chemistry rabbit hole sometimes. So the process to get the sodium carbonate, because you want the sodium carbonate, you don't want all the other just carbon ash stuff, right? So what they would do, and somebody figured this out before we really knew what chemistry was,
Right.
you would mix the ash in water.
Huh.
And the sodium carbonate is soluble in water, but a lot of the other stuff is not. So you'd mix it up, you'd let all the other stuff sink, then you'd pour off the water that now has dissolved sodium carbonate in it, and then you'd boil off the water, and you're left with a relatively pure powder that you can use for your glass making.
Interesting. But they still took the time to figure that one out, like
Yeah.
it's really cool.
The other one, by the way, actually for potash, which you will know is what's the word in Spanish? It's the traditional way to nixtamalize corn is basically with wood ash.
Cal.
And potash is that cal. Cal is potassium carbonate, I think.
Yes.
Anyway, it's one of those things that basifies the water to nixtamalize the corn. So you could probably use soda ash too, but it may be different.
Yeah. I
yeah.
almost chose corn, but I don't think corn's a plant.
Corn is a plant. We did a corn
You did
episode
corn?
very early. I'm gonna do a corn sequel at some point too, because corn is such, I mean, a plant that is influenced the world and its history is just so fascinating. And
And there's hundreds of varieties.
yeah, and just how it so rapidly kind of took over the world, and so the episode was pretty interesting because my friend who chose it is from Romania, and it's not where it's from at all, but basically corn very rapidly displaced a lot of traditional food crops, and so she was talking about it in this context of how it kind of changed Romanian cuisine.
Interesting.
And then also there was this negative side of it too, because the Europeans didn't know about nixtamalization, and if you only eat corn and you don't nixtamalize it, you can actually get sick.
Yes.
And so there was all this disease in Europe because the Europeans didn't know
Yes.
about that, and they were eating only corn, right?
Yes.
So it was because it's such a productive plant.
Very much. And the nixtamalization of the corn is imperative because our bodies cannot process it.
Exactly. And you miss some major chemicals. So anyway, I'm going to do a corn sequel at some point because it's a cool. That's one of the. There's I'm trying not to duplicate plants, but there's a few that I have on my list. So we're going to do a second one, and corn is a big one. So.
And have you heard of the Guerreras del Maíz, the warriors of the corn, in Mexico? So there's So for your sequel, you can talk to them.
Okay, I'll Google it. We'll keep that as suspense for the audience, and I'll get into that. Cool. Well, I think that wraps up our discussion here about the Monstera Adansonii, or the Swiss cheese plant, and Romeritos. So, Pam, thank you for joining me on this episode.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me and humoring me on my rabbit holes.
Let's talk about queerness in plants. Now, as someone who does not identify as queer, I admit that I never really thought about that before until it was brought up by Pam when she was talking about the Monstera Adansonii. And some of you might think that this is not a correct way or scientific way of thinking about plants as queer, but I have to say, after doing some research, I think it's absolutely correct. And in fact, when you look at plants and their ways of being, the idea that gender is a construct becomes very clear, at least to me, because plants have a wide variety of ways of being, of different kinds of sexual and asexual reproduction. In just a few examples, plants can have male and female parts on the same flower. They can have male flowers and female flowers on the same plant. They can have male flowers on one plant and female flowers on a different plant. There's plants that can change their reproductive sex. So I could go on and on. The ways of being for plants is just so broad. In fact, at the beginning of the show, when I was talking about the perfect flowers that have both male parts and female parts on the same flowers, scientifically, those flowers could also be referred to as bisexual. So I think it's a very valid way, I think, of thinking of plants, and it helps, I think, us consider how our language and the way we refer to things can change the way we think, perhaps. And on that topic, while I was doing this research, I found a very interesting short blog post by a scientist named Will Dwyer that is called Plants and Queerness. And to end the show, I would like to read just a small snippet of that. Now, Will writes, "Plants, like queerness, suggest new ways of being, living, and loving. They are bisexual, they are trans, asexual, polyamorous, hermaphrodite, and gender fluid. They are other. They are in between, alive like animals, but seemingly still as minerals. Plants are everywhere, proud and strong, and often hidden in plain sight. They make their presence known by their gifts to the world, shelter, nourishment, a breath of fresh air. Queerness can be all those things too, a home, a family, a source of sustenance." I'll put a link to the entire blog post in the show notes, and thanks to Will for letting me read that segment. It was a very insightful piece. You can read the whole thing in the show notes. And with that, let's end the show. Thanks for listening. My guest on this episode of Rootbound was Pam Covarrubias. Pam is a coach and podcaster who hosts the podcast Café con Pam. You can learn more about that podcast at the website cafeconpalm.com or find it wherever you get your podcasts. If you like Rootbound and you want to help support the show, visit rootboundpodcast.com/support to find all the ways you can support the show, including leaving a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Rootbound is hosted by totally imperfect podcaster Steve Ellington. Music by Christian Kriegescota. Fake ads by David Lonnie. Rootbound is a podcast about plants for when you're stuck inside, but if you can go outside, look for the perfect flower, even if it's only perfect to you.
Root nodules! Who doesn't love a good nodule?